Hi, everybody. Welcome to Green Justice. Today, I'm here with Paula in the studio, and we're very happy to have with us Dr. Philip Aghoghovwia. What's that?
That's great. Second try, and you nailed it.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, the hardest part over. Who is faculty in the English Department at KPU and is a researcher and scholar in environmental humanities, African literatures, energy and water studies, and the cultures and politics of resource extraction in the post-colonial world. His most recent works have appeared in Routledge Interventions, Cambridge University Press, and a recent monograph entitled Violent Ecotraps, Petroculture in the Niger Delta. So welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for being here. So we thought maybe to begin, you could perhaps give us a bit of background on yourself, and because I know that your background informs your work, being from the Niger Delta, an area that, from what I know, is incredibly ecologically productive and rich, but also culturally, and has suffered significantly from the resource blight, as I think you call it, the resource curse of the resource blight, or what have you.
I am not sure it is ecologically productive.
Okay.
Because it is the very embodiment of ecological destruction.
Right.
Yes. So I know that's a very sober note on which to begin.
But so you're saying, historically though, like it's...
Yes, historically it is ecologically rich, but not ecologically productive in the sense that it has the misfortune of being blessed with ecological diversity and people, of course, as well as being blessed as well and cursed with oil.
Yeah.
Cursed for all the reasons I'm sure you've encountered in my book. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say it is productive, because to say something is productive means it is experiencing some kind of well-being as we speak.
Oh,
Because for something to be productive, it's enjoying some kind of equilibrium, some kind of well-being, some kind of, ultimate goal, right?
right.
But that's not the case with the Niger Delta.
Right.
Yeah, so it is rich, but it is experiencing extreme degradation, environmental degradation, and social deprivation of its people and of the environment. But anyway, that's just one one thing I wanted to clarify. Yes, I was born in the Niger Delta, and I was initially educated in Nigeria, and then I left Nigeria, I think at the end of the 2010s, to go to South Africa, where I received my PhD. And yes, the Niger Delta has continued to inform my thinking, my intellectual work. I was often struck by the paradox I just described now, a place being rich with biodiversity, but at the same time cursed. A place having all of these gifts of nature, biodiversity, oil deposits, but at the same time embodying all that we have come to associate with the post-colony, right? A place where there is so much poverty, where justice remains a dream, where the good life remains an inebriated dream, not just any kind of dream of a sane person, but someone who's drunk, And so I was often struck by that contradiction, and so I wanted to understand the situation more, and which was why I decided to focus on literatures of the environment, on representations of the environment, precisely the Niger Delta, and decided to undertake my research studies in that area. And in order to know more and in order to equip myself with the necessary vocabulary to engage with this paradox. And for that reason, my PhD was on the representations of the environment and representations of oil. And with that, I also explored the nation state, the nation state that allows this situation to go on for so long. And yeah, and that project was funded by I got a scholarship in South Africa, Stellenbosch University to be precise, on this Partnership for Africa Development Program, Pangaea, and it was funded by Carnegie Corporation of New York. You see the irony there because my work over time in one breath critiques the actions and inactions of corporations in the post-colony, but at the same time being funded by
the legacy of a robber baron.
Yes, by these same corporations. But I think that is part of the paradox that I'm talking about. So perhaps my work in itself, while engaging in the paradox of extraction, also exemplifies that paradox. Maybe I'm also a walking paradox.
Well, I think we all are, right? To various extents. But yeah, that's interesting. And because that is an issue that you talk about in your work, like the what is to be done issue and the challenges around violence, like the violence of the oil production, but also the violence in response to it, and how both are problematic, right? And how, because everybody's kind of embedded in these circuits of production, and how exactly do you get outside of them, and how exactly do you bring change? But perhaps before we get onto that, I wanted to maybe talk a bit more about violence. You talk about slow violence, which is an interesting term.
That's Nixon's coinage. Rob Nixon's coinage.
I
mean, one thing, just to keep out. I'm not going to make it all about me.
He'll ask a question and wait.
I'm not going to answer
I have more
that
to
for
say.
you. Well, no,
it's a conversation.
I wanted to set it up a bit.
Interjections are welcomed.
Yeah. But, that's my excuse. I teach corporate white-collar crime. One of the things I always ask the class is at the start is, about, I get them to think about stereotypical images of crime and criminality, but also violence, right? And I ask them, what is violent crime?
Yeah.
And of course, they all talk about classic street crime, interpersonal violence,
physical violence.
Physical violence, right? And I'm like, okay, but, what if a corporation makes a decision to release its toxic waste into a town's water supply and 1,000 people get cancer, right? Is that violence, right? Because then when you ask them what is white collar or corporate crime, they'll talk about, well, it's insider trading or it's stuff, which of course are crimes, right?
Yes.
But they never talk about violence. So one of the things I try to get them to do is to rethink this notion of violence and make the argument that actually there's far more violence that's perpetrated by corporations than all the street violence put together. But anyway, so I think it relates to this notion, very much to oil production in the Niger Delta. So yeah, I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the violence of the oil production versus the violence in the response, like the different types of violence, like if you want to.
Yeah, well,
there's so much.
Lead in.
Because a lot has been said about violence.
Yeah.
Not only the violence of pollution, as you put it, and as Rob Nixon eloquently explores and theorizes, and in the process enriching how we see pollution of any sort, or how we see despoilation, not just pollution, because often when we think about pollution, we think of something that happens and in a moment in time is fixed. But the despoilation, the degradation of places, not just of land and of water bodies, but of a whole landscape, including its people, and in the process, depriving them of any kind of ecological well-being, right?
Yeah.
So a lot has been said about that. A lot has also been said about the manner in which this kind of injustice, this ecological despoilation, this devastation of landscape is protested, right? And because that is often what captures the public imagination when we think about the Niger Delta, the militants. And that's what I opened my book with, right? The militants, in their own way, often misguided way of drawing attention to this injustice, resort to that kind of violence, right? Kidnapping oil workers, even burning down villages where its people are not necessarily in support of their own methods, right? So the violence is often performed, right? But in the same way, it is also experienced by people because of the manner in which it inflicts a kind of damage on the environment, but also the manner in which it is protested. And what I try to do in my work is to look at both of these and see how the focus on these two is producing even a new kind of violence, a different kind of violence, a violence to even perception, such that becomes what is often captured, what is often focused on in the process, the actual experience of people, the experience of injustice, the experience of this kind of hopelessness, of world-ending cataclysm is often elided, right?
Right.
And so that becomes what my work tries to do. And what I try to tease out is that filmmakers have also come to understand the nature of how this violence operates, such that their attempt to capture these two kinds of violence often results in deploying language and visual code that in and of themselves utilizes or embodies this violence. So violence in that process becomes not just metaphoric, but also metonymic.
Right.
Yes. That is to say, it understands that the only way to really talk about this place is to use the language of violence. So it's not just a metaphor for representing, but also connected to violence in a way that is metonymic. It becomes a part of the way in which this ecological injustice is talked about. And you find that in the language of the literature. You find out that in the artistic decisions that filmmakers take, in the way that they capture this situation. You also find that in the way that writers understand even the infrastructure of oil. How the infrastructure of oil, such as the pipes that flow up gas, fire itself, all of these represent the forms of violence inflicted on this place. So that's what I was trying to tease out, to understand how violence works. That is, it is not just that's physical, spectacular, material violence, but one that permeates every aspect of how the Niger Delta is thought about, how the Niger Delta is perceived, and how the Niger Delta is experienced.
Right. It has this kind of totalizing quality, would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know you talk about Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope.
Yeah.
right? The Paul is laughing because I said I wasn't going to mention this.
Yeah.
But
Second question.
the, the manifestation of like, space and time in the literature and the different forms that takes. And it seems like the oil production itself kind of displaces these other, local and provincial understandings.
It tries to.
Yeah.
But when we encounter representations, local representations of Niger Delta, you see that there is a tussle between some kind of battle for, not necessarily battle for ownership, but battle for sense of presence in this place.
Yeah.
Is it most thinkers I name such as James Ferguson, even to an extent Amitav Ghosh, talk about the sites of oil extraction as a place that is no place at all.
Right.
A place that is
Kind of hyper modern.
by the fact of its constitution, international, heterogeneous, and therefore a no place.
Yeah.
That is to say, the logic of the market inflicts on this space of extraction this idea of an international space, international place where all simply extract. So it's not a place inhabited by people, or even when it is inhabited, they are either superfluous or they are intruding on this space, which is constituted as international. But the literature that tries to make sense of this experience of extraction articulates from a place that is thoroughly indigenous, thoroughly autochthonous. In fact, it even expresses the experience of oil in the language that is vernacular, in the language of the land, the language of the people. And therefore, there's this clash between this logic of an international space, as well as against the way that local people perceive their space as a space of habitation, as a vernacular space. So there's this clash between these two senses. Again, what emerges out of that is this violence, this almost epistemic violence. How do we understand place? How do we conceive of place?
Yes.
When we think about the Niger Delta, for instance, or when we think about this oil landscape, how do we think of it as place? As inhabited, that is inhabited by actual people.
Yeah.
Versus how the oil industry would conceive of that place. Is it actually an oil scape?
Yes.
Or it is a place inhabited by actual people with long history, with connection, with life.
Which is still felt in the present, right? And
Yes.
which can still be brought into the present. Is it if Awodu, who talks about the signs, like using the keep out signs and the danger signs and turning them into poetry and like that kind of reclamation and kind of subversion of that attempt, like to exclude and to turn the place into just this abstraction of capital. Also, I was struck by the Ken Saro-Wiwa's daughter, Sarah.
Yes, Zena.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, so just to quickly go back, so that's what I was trying to make Bakhtin help me understand.
Right.
This, how to think of place, space and time, and how that's and how it is encountered.
Right.
Not only by the writer, but also in their attempts to imagine how people relate to this space. Is it really a space that only houses the oil infrastructure, or place that houses life?
Right.
In a general sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're looking at me, so it's cue Paula to talk. Go ahead, Paula.
I feel like
it's the Greg show for the most part. It's the Greg show.
You take the lead on this one. I'm going to quote her. I'm going to throw the
I
back.
did. And then he
Always the
mentioned,
gentleman. I'm going to throw the pole at probably inopportune time, but
Well, he did specify I have about 13 seconds of recording time
that's right.
for this
So
episode,
use
so
them wisely.
I'll make use of them. Well, I mean, what I was thinking when I was reading through Violent Ecotropes, I was thinking about, all the media that you're referring to, and you've made reference to this as well, right? Talking about poetry, talking about photographs and things like this. In my experience from thinking about, representations of environmental issues and justice, from comic books and graphic novels, right? And the performative engagement of readers when they're going through this content, kind of agency that they have going through panels, filling in gaps in the narrative and things like that. So I was wondering maybe if you want to speak a little bit more. I mean, you already have, but to the extent of, this media, right? Thinking even about poetry and how it captures not just understanding of this, but also that experience, right? It's like really allowing for that experiential engagement of the reader, right? Or the audience.
Yes, like you said, I think I have made my point
Yeah.
with the book.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
To say more is to not allow the book now take a life of its own,
Right.
which is the hope of every writer.
Yeah.
Their happy fate of being read
Yes.
and being interpreted,
Yes.
and also hopefully misinterpreted.
Yeah.
so that the book takes a life of its own. But yes, but what I don't know if I intentionally chose poetry or poetry chose me,
Right.
because I'm not a writer. I happen to be one of those few Nigerians in the humanities who don't write creative works.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I had a bathroom break when God or Providence was blessing that stereotypical Nigerian with the gift of creative writing. So, but poetry chose me because of what I wanted to foreground, what I wanted to understand about the Niger Delta. Poetry, by its very nature, is a private form. It's one of those few genres that explores interiority, the inner life or the inner world of the writer.
Mm-hmm.
But that even this private form enters into the public space of ecological discourse, or the public space of the fraught nationalism that oil extraction has brought into being in that contraption called Nigeria, says something of the injunction to intervene, right?
Yeah.
Because if something which is primarily private, a private form, chooses to enter this public arena, it shows that it identifies the urgency to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is quite different from the novel. I'm sure you will notice that my book does not include the novel.
No.
That is an academic choice, because when you Google, you do any search of eco-critical work done on the Niger Delta, you're likely to find more studies on the novel than, say, poetry or short video film or photography. Yeah, so it was a choice I made to not explore the novel, because the novel is very public. As you mentioned Bakhtin earlier, Bakhtin is one of those theories make us think of the novel as thoroughly dialogic, right?
Right.
That is, the novel is invested in some kind of public debate, if I may put it so crassly. And that is to say, it encourages this kind of dialogue, character dialogue, engaging with history. So it is very public in that sense, but poetry is not. And so I wanted to show how the concerns in the Niger Delta are actually felt at the personal level, at the individual level. So that is one reason for using poetry. Because initially we were talking about how there's so much focus on this performative violence by militants, right?
Mm.
So often we don't think of those who are affected by oil extraction as people, right?
Mm.
People who are also individual human beings. But poetry allows us to see that
Yeah.
this situation is actually affecting people at a very personal level.
Mm.
And that's something that poetry helps us to see. And when it comes to other forms, such as photography, I was also interested in three objectives actually shape the book. One is representation
Mm.
in a general sense. How is the story of oil told, and how do we frame understanding of oil extraction in order to adequately tell the story? And I thought photography also helps because of the ways that our sense of what is happening there is enframed by photography itself. Because one of the most famous photographs of militancy, or one of the most famous portraits of youth violence or militancy, whatever you want to call it, coming out of the Niger Delta, is in photograph, right? It is completely enframed for all time. And so I was interested in the power of photography. What does photography foreground? In its capacity to enframe something, it often leaves other things out,
Mhm.
right? And often the things left out, I thought, were more important than the things foregrounded. Because a photographer is only interested in capturing a certain moment, whereas that moment has a background
Yeah.
which is sometimes more profound and more
Context. Yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to bring into the frame.
Mm.
Right.
That which photography leaves out. And I hope I tried to use my own writing to bring that back into the frame. And so that's what I was trying to tease out with my discussion of how photographs work, not only in the prologue to the book, but also in the epilogue,
Mm.
showing
Kind of bookends.
yes, bookending both, showing what photography can also do
Mm.
by teasing out some kind of context, some kind of history behind what is enframed, what is captured by the photograph, in order for us to see. And once you see what is not foregrounded, but what equally exists in the photograph, you cannot unsee it. And that's what I hope the book achieves at the end. So that's another thing that informed my choice of these other representational forms.
Mm. Yeah.
Looking back at me again. Next question, Paula. No, that's beautifully put. And I think, the audience, whatever audience we have, is probably going to be very interested in reading Violent Ecotropes, which is now available at the KPU library, right?
Yes, it wasn't at the library, but
Wasn't at the library.
But I got onto the library.
Oh,
and now it is.
Thanks. Yeah, it's long overdue.
Yeah.
I think
For sure. Yeah.
And yeah, I hope I'm not trying to sell the book here, but yeah, listeners can also find it maybe on Amazon, I think.
Right.
I don't know what specific bookshop sells it in Canada, but it was published in South Africa, and
Right.
yes, and I think it's distributed in I don't know, in Europe. Blackwell. I was told that Blackwell is the main distributor in England, so I don't know who's distributing the book in North America. But
Yeah, it was mentioned in those emails.
It was.
I can't remember offhand.
Definitely read those emails.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of back and forth around getting it. But
okay,
it's available in an electronic form at the KPU.
Oh yes. I think by Braille, the electronic version of it is by Braille. Braille should be in the Netherlands, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, the library has it if students and faculty are listening. But
Read it.
yes. Sorry, did you have another question, Paula? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the book because it will be read by students and faculty.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. But yeah, just like on that line, and I think Greg was kind of alluding to this earlier in terms of, the potential from this and the experience of reading the poetry, but also kind of how it engages collective sentiment or collective, activism or resistance or potential for that in a positive or effective way, maybe. So if you can speak to it without kind of delving too much into the text.
Well, it's not possible to talk about the environment in any ethical way without being activist. It is not possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know generalize by saying human action, because that really gets a lot of people off the hook. But we know that not only historically, even now, corporate capitalism as it currently exists, if not colonial imperialism, has not been kind to nature, has not been kind to the environment.
To put it mildly, I would say.
Yeah.
Exactly. and therefore, to begin to talk about the environment in any meaningful way, or about nature more generally, is to actually speak in the vocabulary of activism.
Mm.
Because historically and even ontologically right now, as we live through it, right? The very fact of how things are today is unjust. And therefore, one has to speak in the language of that.
Mm-hmm.
And if one must speak in that language, in that activist language, one must bring the same cast of mind to how conversations about sustainability, how to build a world beyond the one that carbon has made possible, has to be talked about in that same way, in that same activist sentiment, activist language, by being unequivocal in the way we name the culprit, the culprit. And in naming them, we're not only shaming them, but we are also insisting that they take into account this historical injustice done in the name of progress, but injustice inflicted on the environment, on nature, and on people who live contiguously to that desired landscape or desired form of nature. Yeah. So that is the assumption I bring to my writing. If it is not clear that it is in the language of activism, then I am to blame. But that is the assumption I bring, because I think there is no other way to talk about the earth in the throes of this rampant will to consume, rampant will to extract as much as possible. And there's no other way to talk about it outside of the language of activism, because it's only in that cast of mind that we can really nudge the levers of power to consider the ethical implications of their actions. Yeah, so that's what informs. I don't know if I got your question right, but that's what informs my kind of writing. So I try to deploy the language of activism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that comes across very
Definitely.
much so.
Yeah.
How does that activism become effective, I guess is the word. Because you talk about the corruption at the national level,
Mhm.
as well as at the local, right? So it seems that, where is the appropriate locus of resistance. What is the relation? Because you talked about making our leaders more ethical and pushing them, nudging them to become more ethical, but they don't really seem to show a lot of either, from what I know of, Nigeria, Africa, but also here.
Yeah.
They don't really they seem to be captured to a large extent by capital, Uh, what, how do we affect change, I guess? This is a very big question, but
Well,
how does that relate to the lived experience and the activism that you see
Yeah.
captured in these Nigerian
I,
writers as well?
I don't know whether change will come, whether we, in quote, can actually affect change, except that what seems to be the case when it comes, for instance, to the Niger Delta, is that history is actually superseding the local demands. And what do I mean by that? Change has not come, change will not come, but that the world is moving away from oil without addressing the damage it has left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I mean by history is superseding the change you seek.
Mm.
So change is happening, but it's a different kind of change. It's not a change that addresses injustice.
Mm.
It's change that is bringing about abandonment. We are moving on. We are moving on from oil, but we are not, but the people left behind still living with the effects of the damage. So the change that is coming or the change that is happening is not one brought about by people, but by history. This onward march of modernity's conception of progress, right? So we are moving on from oil. We are trying to decarbonize.
Yeah.
But that is also leaving the people and also leaving their claim, all the claims they are making, claims to justice, is also leaving all that behind, rendering them irrelevant or anachronistic. Because we are moving on from oil. Therefore, what you're claiming that we have done to you in the name of oil is now irrelevant because we no longer need oil. Yeah. So that's the kind of change that is happening. I know it sounds cynical, but that's the fact. That's how I understand it, how I observe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are not bringing about change, except change is happening to us by the fact of the onward march of history.
And people just get left as the detritus of history.
Yes, absolutely. And they live in what Naomi Klein has called sacrifice zones.
Yeah, sacrifice
to this progress, that we perpetually seek, right?
Yes. On that, I wanted to ask, do you see parallels or differences between oil production in the Niger Delta and in Canada? I mean, most notably, perhaps in Canada, from an environmental perspective, is of course the oil sands or the tar sands, as that should be known, were known. It seems like there may be some of the same issues in terms of local capture, but some differences as well. We just had the completion of TMX, right? The pipeline that's going to ship 900,000 barrels of highly toxic dilbit right into the heart of
the Gulf Coast, right?
Yeah. But it seems like there's an enormous, in some ways it's similar. There's the tremendous impact on the local population, right? From the oil sands. There's the, including poisoning, right? You have places like Fort Chip where the cancer rates are through the roof because of the effluent from this incredibly destructive form of oil production. But it's different too. Like you don't get the oil bunkering. You don't get there has been actually there has been militant resistance, I should say, but it's taken a different form. Of course, Canada itself is a colonial power in itself, also a colony, but also a neo-colonial power that is involved in extractive industries around the world. Is of course the largest player in the mining industry around the world and so on. So it has this kind of dual role. There's when it comes to Indigenous people, there's the actual, terra nullius doctrine of displacement, and there's resistance there. But I don't know. I just wondered if you had thoughts on similarities or differences between Nigeria and Canada.
Yes. Yes. I think the short answer is yes, there is similarity to the extent that everywhere oil has been extracted at scale has experienced some kind of devastation. Devastation that such a landscape can certainly not recover from.
Mm-hmm.
And here I'm thinking of not just of Canada, but virtually everywhere where oil has been extracted at scale. Thinking as you were speaking earlier, I was just jotting down so I don't forget the names. In Venezuela, I remember in the 1950s, when Venezuela was the darling of American oil executives, and Maracaibo in Venezuela was in the 1950s what the Niger Delta came to be in the 1990s, right? It was the darling of cheap, easy to access oil.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the landscape of Maracaibo is unsightly.
Mm-hmm.
It has lain waste to that. Again, the change we're talking about. So it has been superseded by history, right?
Yeah.
And nothing has been done, but the world has moved on. Then you also have Baku in Central Europe. Baku was the should I say the center, the very hub of oil extraction for the Soviet Union, the Soviet states.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the oil landscape in Baku has been remediated, but we know that the landscape of Baku has been transformed forever by the same oil extraction. The world has moved on from that. I know that the oil operation, especially in Alberta, is more like a mining operation.
Yeah.
In that sense, it probably is more damaging. It probably scarifies the landscape more than the conventional oil extraction.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I don't think it is any different from these places I've just mentioned. There's also Titusville in the US. I think is it Oklahoma area or Pennsylvania area? I don't know. And I know it's in Midwest of the US. So the Niger Delta follows in that terrible genealogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is to that extent that I would say it is similar, except I like to think I live in Canada now, and it's a democratic state, and they kind of I know First Nations people have been historically disenfranchised, but they kind of power that democracy is beginning to I don't want to say give. I don't want to say democracy is giving them power to articulate their concerns, but the kind of power that democracy affords in Canada is not at all available to peoples of the Niger Delta.
Yeah.
So it is to that extent, I would say it is different because democracy only exists on paper in the case of Nigeria. And therefore, they're not able to use the platforms, the instruments afforded by democracy to bring attention to the damages, the evils of extraction in the way that I like to think that Canada allows.
Right.
And so it is to that extent that the two contexts are different. But of course, the damage is the same.
Yeah.
Because, because it's a mining operation. So I think it's even probably worse in terms of the kind of damage it is doing too, because they literally are shaving off parts of the earth in order to extract that very dirty oil from Canada. So it's doing the same kind of violence to the environment, but because of the nature of democracy here, at least the little I've observed of it, I see that people really have rights, people have voice to draw attention to these things. And even when the government does not respond adequately, it does respond.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one thing I was thinking of is the difference in the actual production. Because yes, like you say, there's actually two types. There's one that's like strip mining. There's another that's more like fracking, like an underground type.
Yes.
Both are extremely destructive, but in different ways.
Yes.
But if you look at these actual mines, like they're the size of Vancouver, right? And you begin by like destroying the living layer of the earth.
Absolutely.
And then you mine it down. So like recovery, like the idea of reclamation seems...
It's impossible.
It's impossible. And also it's not something that's one potential difference. Maybe like people are living with the oil production, as harmful as it is in the Niger Delta, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you can't live with this, right? Like you're just forcibly displaced. But I think, the other difference in the political system, the fact that you do have more formal democracy here. Although, again, that's why I was thinking of the national versus the local, because you have here you do have more local control in the sense of provincial, right?
Yes.
So kind of subnational.
Yes.
But the downside to that is the lower you go, certainly at the provincial level, you're vulnerable. You're that much vulnerable to capture. Like the Alberta government is just a subsidiary of the oil industry. Like it really is.
And it doesn't pretend at all.
It doesn't pretend. But there is that, at least theoretical.
Yes, especially
facade.
They're very rambunctious.
And you do have like
premier. He doesn't pretend at all.
But like before that, we had Rachel Notley, right? Who was, before she became premier, had a pretty solid legacy of being a progressive, not radical, but progressive. I mean, obviously, I'm betraying my own biases here, but like a decent politician. When she became premier, and then BC was like, we're not gonna allow TMX. I mean, she's set her hair on fire. Basically, she's we're gonna ban all the wine. Like she becomes just the absolute peon of the industry. So it's kind of this argument that it's not really about the individual personality. It's about the role that they play in a structure, right?
Yes.
Which is very hard to change. But Indigenous people do have been on the front lines of resistance. Do have that, not only their own laws and powers, but also have constitutional power.
Yes.
Which there, I mean, I don't know. I know we've been going a while now, but is there anything in terms of that Indigenous relationship? Because I know there are, like, within certain African states recognized like Indigenous people, right? And quote, like the Maasai within Kenya and stuff. Is there anything like that in Nigeria?
Well, you mentioned Kensariwa earlier. He tried to champion that in the early 90s at the UN, at the level of the UN, where he was able to locate the aspirations of his own people, the Ogoni, and by extension, the Niger Delta, in the Unrepresented Peoples Organization. I think is at the Hague, but that was in the 90s. But nothing came of that,
right?
Because as I'm sure Nigeria operates some kind of federalism, almost like a farcical version of the one practiced in the United States, because states actually have rights. States actually jostle with the federal government in the US, but that is not the same in Nigeria. The states are just lame ducks. Most of them are unproductive, so they actually exist because of the oil. So they don't really hold the federal government to account.
Right.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, so they're not really carrying the interest of their people when they interact with the federal government. They are not interested in that.
Right.
Because the states are not viable. They depend. In fact, they exist because of oil. Without oil, most of those states would collapse. Yeah. So in that sense, because it's a federal kind of governance, on paper, it would seem that local people, the provinces, the municipalities have power, but they actually don't. And therefore, their interests are not really taken into account. The oil, it's usually governed by people who are far removed from where it is extracted. They are sitting
Right.
in Abuja. Even the so-called local representatives that the federal government appoints, because there's a commission that is meant to oversee oil. I think it's called OMPADEC. I don't know if it has changed. I've left Nigeria for almost 1.5 decades now. But even those people who are appointed from the Niger Delta to sit in this commission, they are appointed and they are moved to Abuja.
Right.
So they are 500 miles away from where the damage has been done.
Right.
And yeah, so they don't even know what is happening there. And so in that sense, they kind of control that. I hope. I'm not so sure of how it works in the Canadian context, but the kind of control that I suppose Indigenous people have, or the kind of voice that they have when it comes to the operations of the mining operations in the Alberta tar sands, is non-existent in the Niger Delta. Absolutely not.
Right.
And so now we're coming back to the idea of violence as strategy. So it is out of that frustration that they take to these kinds of whether it be performative violence or actual violence as a way of airing their own grievances, as a way of drawing attention to their very legitimate concern.
Yes.
Because they're not able to do that through the democratic process.
Right. Yes. But you talk about is it the third type of violence that's neither revolutionary nor non-revolutionary, that is that kind of lived experience that we were talking about earlier?
Yes.
Yeah.
I also mentioned violence as currency because...
Yes, that's right, yeah.
What qualifies you to enter into the whole extraction process or to benefit from that wealth is your ability to either threaten with violence or actually use violence as a way.
Right.
Yes, and that is what qualifies most of the so-called local voices, at least as we now have them, not in the era of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who used non-violent strategies, who wrote about these things, who mobilized people, actual people, to protest, who debated the big oils, debated government on the best way to... Because he was very practical.
Right.
He wasn't campaigning for the discontinuation of extraction. Rather, he was campaigning for a proper governance.
Right.
Yeah. Proper policies that would benefit what he thought to be the primary beneficiaries, the Niger Delta, right? And so he was really, and he was very knowledgeable in these things because he had been part of the establishment at some point. Of course, that's another day's debate, right? But yeah, so he was very, very much locked into the whole governance process. And so he wanted the benefit to actually accrue to the people.
Yeah.
And of course, that's by the time he was murdered by the federal government, locals came to see that strategy did not work. And therefore, out of frustration, also because they lack the kind of astuteness that he had.
Right, the savvy.
Yes, his own media savvy, his understanding of Nigerian politics, they lack all that. And therefore, they've resorted to this kind of violence as a way of still drawing attention to the same problem.
Right.
But using a different method. And so part of what I try to to tease out is how your ability to threaten with violence, your ability to use violence becomes in itself some kind of visa. That's what qualifies you to
I see.
participate in either in accessing the wealth or in determining how much oil gets to the market or in determining access to the oil itself.
Right.
So that then qualifies you to do that.
Mm.
And and what writers try to do, at least from how I understand what has come out of the Niger Delta post Kensariwa, is to identify that maybe in order to talk about this situation, we also need to find a way to articulate it, to find a way to script the circumstance in a language that is akin to violence, in a language that draws attention to itself, in a language that makes the reader or the listener become aware of that existence of violence.
Right.
That's in the vocabulary of violence as such. Yeah. So that's what I try to tease out in the book. Yeah.
As a precursor to moving beyond violence, like, do you think there's still hope, maybe perhaps through that as part of a process of, seeing a nonviolent movement emerge again, and perhaps another Kensariwa figure, another Agoni?
Yes. I hope I concluded the book on that positive note, that it is inevitable that the Niger Delta will experience a post-oil possibility, but it's a post-oil possibility that, unlike the international circuit of extraction, when they move on, they leave behind all the scars and the damage. But what I try to tease out in the book is that the post-oil possibility, the post-oil imagination, is aware of the scars of the past, is aware of the damage done.
Right.
And it takes with it that awareness. It takes with it the fact of that in scripting, in imagining a post-oil possibility.
Right.
But one that consigns oil to history. One that looks to all that was good in the past, pre-oil. Also, one that is good during the oil dispensation. And in order to build a future that is keenly aware of the immediate past, but chooses to move on to rebuild from the rubble of oil's detritus.
Right.
And in that sense, it is as positive as it can get.
Right. Well, on that.
Yeah, because
cheery.
Yes. Yeah. And I know when we talk about global warming and climate change, I don't know which one precedes which, or which one produces which, whether it is climate change, which is producing global warming, or global warming, which is, global warming is accelerating the ways in which the climate changes, right? So when we talk about that discourse, we like to express our concerns about the world ending, right? Which is also why when most scientists, when they come up with their own scientific models, when a certain threshold is exceeded, talk about world ending. But in a place such as the Niger Delta, the world has already ended.
Right.
Yeah. And which is why when you read the literature coming out of there, or any kind of artistic creation coming out of there, they're already talking about the post-oil world. So the world of oil has already come to an end. But this ending is brought about not by action, by activism, but by history.
Right. By material conditions.
And so they are keenly aware of that, and they're already building a world beyond that. So I think it's the same thing with much of the post-colonial world. we are not so locked into this idea of some kind of imminent apocalypse.
Because you've already experienced it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Time and again.
Yeah.
Sometimes, multiple times, including you're asking me to compare the Niger Delta with First Nations, including First Nations people. They've experienced this world-ending event time and again, and they've had to find ways to rebuild, find ways to, while moving on from that traumatic experience, but taking with them the lessons learned from that.
Yeah.
And so the same is the case with the Niger Delta.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're moving on. The post-oil world is already afoot.
Yeah.
And we just need to get on to the bus before the bus leaves us.
All right. Well, that's probably a good note to end it. So thank you. You've been very generous with your time, and thanks for talking so much about your work and Nigerian writers in the Niger Delta. That was great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having me.
Phil.